you're among the Ashkenazi Jews, it's Yom Kippur. But we want to take just a few minutes, talk about things, but more, one of the things that's really important when you look at the feast that God gives us is how do we involve ourselves in the feast? Because too much of what we do in our culture is we are an audience and we watch people do things, which isn't entirely bad, but these feasts that the Lord gives us, they're something that we're to do and to engage in. And it's interesting that Greg mentioned Genesis and the story of Adam and Eve. And I think everybody knows in that story of Adam and Eve that they went from being comfortable in God's presence to when he came to the garden, it makes this statement in Genesis 3:8. They hid from God's presence. Why did they hide from God's presence? I mean, you need to think about this a minute, because if you ever stop to realize that the whole thing of Yom Kippur is about the presence of the Lord. And where are you in reference to it? It's interesting that I'm always puzzled by men and women who are godly, who hear the voice of the Lord, and then go do just horrific things. How does that happen? How is that possible? I mean, Greg and I were talking about the story of Balaam here a little while ago. Does it ever strike you as odd that Balaam hears the voice of the Lord, he speaks the word of the Lord, and yet everything in his character opposes the Lord? He's trying to do things his own way. How does this happen? How do you and I do things that aren't godly when we know what God thinks? And I'll just get practical here. When I was a kid, one of the cardinal rules is thou shalt not peace. If you're old enough to be in my age group, you did not go to the center. You were to eat at meals, and no food was to be eaten outside of meals, and particularly you were not to go into the kitchen and get food. You know what the worst feeling in the whole world is? Is to be in the center sneaking food and the light comes on. Why? Why is that such a bad feeling? Yes, that's kind of what it is. You are naked. You're exposed. When you think about this day, what is God's mechanism for getting his character and his ways inside of you and not on the outside of you? How many of you have done things that you would not have done if your dad had been standing there at your shoulder? Sort of. It's a very important question because we talk about coming into God's presence. How many of you know, and I want you to listen to this question, how many of you know you really don't want God's presence? And why don't you? What happens when God shows up and I don't want to do what God does? Definitely, you lose. And have you ever noticed that we have a tendency to try to draw children, young people, to serve the Lord, which is a wonderful thing? We sometimes make it all exciting and fun. Is it always fun to serve the Lord? Greg mentioned our culture seems to be in a place right now where we're making some very bad choices. And our kids are paying for it. If you look at statistics, there have never been this many suicidal youth. There have never been this many youth that need mental help. There have never been this many that are discouraged, that don't know who they are. They're confused. The way out of this is not easy. It's not exciting. And yet it kind of is. If you go on the live stream of this prayer that's going on in Washington, D.C., you'll see some people that are pretty excited. But the thing that what's on their hearts is they don't want to see America stay on the course that America's on. If you're honest with yourself, is the course that America's on going to take it to a destination that you want to be? I don't think any of us would say that. This doesn't have anything to do with right, left, and between. It's something about there's a destructiveness in our culture. The Day of Atonement is about preparing ourselves to come into the presence of the Lord, and it's removing the contamination from God's people and from his house. Leviticus 16:29, this shall be a permanent statute for you. In the 7th month, on the 10th day of the month, you shall humble your souls and not do any work, whether the native or the alien who sojourns among you. For it is on this day that atonement shall be made for you to cleanse you. You will be clean from all your sins before the Lord. It is to be a Sabbath of solemn rest for you, that you may humble your souls. It is a permanent statute. Are you noticing in that verse things that keep getting repeated? I'm going to ask you again, I've been thinking, some things keep getting repeated. So the priest who is anointed and ordained to serve as priest in his father's place shall make atonement. He shall thus put on the linen garments, the holy garments, and make atonement for the holy sanctuary. And he shall make atonement for the tent of meeting and for the altar. He shall also make atonement for the priests and for all the people of the assembly. Now you shall have this as a permanent statute, to make atonement for the sons of Israel for all their sins once every year. And just as the Lord had commanded Moses, so he did. Very similar. Leviticus 23, verse 26. The Lord spoke to Moses, saying, on exactly the 10th day of this 7th month is the Day of Atonement. It shall be a holy convocation for you, and you shall humble your souls and present an offering by fire to the Lord. You shall not do any work on this same day, for it is a day of atonement, to make atonement on your behalf before the Lord your God. If there is any person who will not humble himself on this same day, he shall be cut off from his people. As for any person who does any work on this same day, that person I will destroy from among his people. You shall do no work at all. It is to be a perpetual statute throughout your generations in all your dwelling places. It is to be a Sabbath of complete rest to you, and you shall humble your souls. On the 9th of the month at evening, from evening until evening, you shall keep your Sabbath. I read those two passages. What things in those passages keep being repeated? Humble. Humble your soul is mentioned 6 or 7 times. Atonement, make atonement. What's another word that keeps showing up? Perpetual, permanent. That's something. See, a lot of Christians read this and they think, well, this doesn't apply to me. But of course this applies to you. I think it's interesting that this million woman prayer, whatever you want to call it, they particularly and specifically chose it for this date. They wanted to be fasting the same day that millions of Jews were fasting. And it's a very pro-Israel gathering. They got up there, they prayed for the hostages. They cried out to the Lord to release them. They cried out for the protection of Israel. They cried out, quite honestly, I'm not sure this is a good thing, but let the head of Hamas be removed. What's that? I know it is. It veers over from the spiritual to the physical. But honestly, why does God? And there's something you haven't told me yet. There's something very important about the Day of Atonement. You've told me it's permanent. You've told me that it is about atonement, that it's about humbling your soul. There's another thing that's stated there over and over. You shall not what? Work. Why? And you know, this is very important. If we don't get this in our souls, why is God saying on this day when he cleanses our, you know, the place where he dwells in our midst? He wants to cleanse that. And he's going to cleanse it with blood. But to do this, there cannot be any work. And we have to humble our soul. Why can't we work on the Day of Atonement? And he says that, and what happens to the person who works? They're cut off from the people. So, you know, we read that and think, well, that seems cruel. But what's it really telling us? That when I choose to work on the Day of Atonement, I take myself away. I remove myself from God's people. This word, anah, which is to humble. How many of you know that it doesn't mean just to fast? And fasting is the way that Jews have traditionally done it, plus other things. And in the New Testament, the only reference to the Day of Atonement, it calls it the fast. So this was something that was done. Yes, great.
History.
Yeah, well, that's a, and I don't necessarily want to go down that rabbit trail, but Greg makes a good point. Let's be honest, one of the things, and I have to appeal to the sages here, work that has to be done is still done. You don't let something starve. You don't let something be hurt. You don't, of course, today you can let yourself starve, but no, it's very difficult. And of course, for Sabbath, the Jews define this as creative work. We're not to do. That gets hard. What does that mean? I think you kind of have to figure out why is it so important on this day that we don't work. And then, of course, it does apply to the Sabbath. And I think in both cases, this is my take, and I'm very interested in what you have to say, that there are certain things that God wants us to allow him to do. And he doesn't want us to help. He doesn't want us to get involved. Now, I will say it's the American way to work all the time. I can still remember when I was preg checking cows with Lad Davies, who's been gone a long time. And Lad had kind of a sad story. That's one of those places that, but I told him, I'm not going to come here and preg check cows on Saturday. I've got to take a day off. And he has a bunch of farmer friends who would not work on Sunday. But he says, I've got too much to do. Because I've got to work every day. How many of you know that if you work 7 days a week, you don't work as efficiently? And it's just fact. And when you look at this one, though, I think, and again, curious what you see here, that it's very important to realize that what God did for you through Yeshua, the atoning blood that was shed, you can't earn it, you can't work for it. Nothing you do enhances it. It's a matter of belief and acceptance. But you can't, do you understand what I'm saying? You can't work for your atonement. Gerald, you had to. Yeah, there's some translations. Yeah, it has this internal factor. You know, I think sometimes that it would be easier if we just did it like they did in the Old Testament. We just go to the temple and watch somebody do it, and you know. But now you actually are in a place where you have to think about this. What does it mean? How does it apply to me? And I think it's interesting, and I've written some things down here. We'll go through it, and I welcome your interactions here. You know, this whole concept of work, I find myself having a hard time not working. I'll find myself just wanting to work, especially. But it's the other side of this. How many of you see? Typically on Sabbath, I don't eat till lunch. And I'm just fine. I don't even think about it. Today I'm starving. Because I know I'm not going to eat. Isn't that the weirdest? It is this, you know, there is something about our fleshly nature that when you say no, then immediately it goes into this mode. How can I get around this? How can I circumvent it? How can I do this? Because there's something in us that doesn't want, like Greg was talking earlier, to hear the voice of the Lord. And for the Lord to come and say, you're not going to eat today, there are several thoughts. Well, why? And does that make any difference? And one of the things you have to realize, sometimes we do things because we're told to. Go ahead, Dallas. We should, for one thing, we shouldn't call it a march. It's not a march. I don't know. I would think, what's that? So I said, it's not, I just said that. It is not a march. I said that because they've had several million people. This is a million-person prayer. You know, is prayer work? I guess it's worth thinking about that. The thing that we might want to keep in mind here, and those are good thoughts, is that who does work on the Day of Atonement? The high priest. The high priest does. Go ahead, Cecilia. There are a lot of people in your boat. Yeah.
But it's hardly, it wouldn't even be or without for me if I read that 14. Anything with half, because I thought, well, maybe tea be okay. But I don't put half of that with my tea. And I know caffeine.
And you know, that's why it's good that it says deny yourself. Yeah, it's rare. It's rare, actually, that Day of Atonement comes on Sabbath. Okay. Yes.
So I think when you look at what's going on, I mean, yeah, every Sabbath after element work, but actually assembling together, doing mass like that is something that work for whatever desire. In mass, get together. I mean, it's good. Group your witness, do it as well. I think there are times, sacred assembly, the solemn assembly, there's something about them. And, you know, go to the capital of our nation, it's in a sense saying the same thing. The Catholic representation of what's going on. So I don't know that anything here, but, you know, for me, it's not an actual area. It's really more saying.
Yeah. So it's good. Go ahead, Carrie.
All I grew up with, you can't, that. Instead of wiring. To me, the legalism blows everything else out of the park. But when I want to go Mars, because they think this is a time focused on yeah. Everybody's going to say, well, of course, if you're out ranking the cars,
Well, you think about it. It's great questions. How many of you know we don't always know why? I mean, and yet Gerald's always talking about it helps to know why. If you know why, it really helps. If you know a deeply observant Jew, they don't have a problem. They've figured it out. They know what they're not going to do, and they don't worry about what they can't do. But Carrie's right. But here's what I've noticed about the kids that grew up with us. Most of them will not eat on this day. They will fast. They might work, they might do every other thing, but they'll keep that aspect of it. I find myself realizing that as human beings, we're on this path. We're in different places on that path. I would hate to lose the reality. Carrie, you kind of touched on this. What's this about? And what it is about is getting rid of all the distractions in my life and coming into the presence of the Lord. And it also is about coming to this place. I don't think that we have the true sense of deliverance that when God says, today you are clean from your sin. And Tyler Don Rosenquist, she said something that really hit me that is similar to this, that believe me, we would all jump for joy. For instance, we know that Margot had a bout with cancer. I know Linda in the Salt Lake branch has just gone through treatments for cancer. We know Brad's in a very tough place right now. Can you imagine if you're in that place? and they've done something, you come, or maybe somebody prays for you, and they come, they check you out, and they say, you don't have any cancer. It's gone. Would you be nonchalant about that? I mean, I think you would probably be, especially if it were you, because cancer is a death sentence. It's in a death sentence. It's a death sentence. And I know part of the reason that I struggle with ceremony and all this stuff is because sin isn't very important to me. You know, Greg talked about it. Several of us have mentioned it. There are things we don't like in our country today. You know, you take the issue of abortion, and I realize a lot of godly people see this very differently. For me, I find it amazing that we're trying to decide how old the baby should be before we shouldn't kill it. Is that weird? Why was that? And I don't want to go down this trail either, but why is that interesting to me? Because it's not sin. No one thinks we should do sin. So you know what society has done? We've defined a lot of things that we want to do, and they're not sin. They're bringing a horrible harvest, but they're still not sin. And when you look at this Day of Atonement, just mention a few things. When was the Day of Atonement given in Israel's history? What big thing had just happened? You remember? If you're an Aaronite, you should know this. Nadab and Abihu did what? They brought strange fire when they were offering incense. And how did God respond to this? He destroyed them. When you offer incense, where are you coming? Into the presence. Incense is right there before the curtain. They were bringing incense. And so after this, God came to Moses and he said, you tell Aaron, don't come in to the most holy place whenever you want. You do it under this set of circumstances. And you know why he was told not to go into the ark whenever he wanted? Because the presence of the Lord dwelt on the ark. Now, I don't know about you, but that hurts my feelings. God says, don't come in here because I'm there. Is sin serious? There's something in the human mind that doesn't see sin as serious. It's serious. It hurts people. It destroys lives. It destroys families. There's reasons that our youth are going through the crisis they're going through. And it's not because we're righteous. But it's amazing to me that God says, don't you come in here. I'm in the cloud over the ark, and you'll die if you come in there. Kai, did you have me?
I know I've been in the realizing that excuse certain sin. It's too hard because I've been down the legal activistic side of things. Ways where you get so hung up on legalistically trying to follow, make sure fitting in whatever, and then if you ever mess up, beat yourself up or whatever. Trying to, there's an interesting way that takes wisdom to know what the value of the purpose is. But more than that, we all sin. We've all sinned. And so it's so important to understand Jesus been on the cross. But more than that, how to apply it to your life in situations. Because for me, that's where I struggle sometimes. How do you repent when something keeps on coming up in your life over and over and over? And so you get to the point sometimes where you, rather than get down on your knees and say, I'm never going to do this again or whatever, you're like, I already know how to do it. You just have to keep on doing it. I I'm not going to make this swear that I'm not going to do it, because it makes it harder the next time I have to get on my knees. So what do you do with that moment of, Lord, I need your grace, I need your presence, I don't know how to put words to it.
Yeah, it definitely is a made-up word.
That is my part. To know how to but not let it keep me down. Recognize how do I keep my eyes on stay turn back, and I don't want to be lifted, but I don't want to.
So I think you said it very well, and I don't believe there's anybody here that's under the illusion that your fleshly nature is not going to erupt at some point in the near future and do something ungodly. I mean, I think just the other day when we went to Madison and we were coming back, and we got to our gate 50 minutes before departure. And the lady said, an hour before, we shut down. And I said, well, I already went online and downloaded my boarding passes, so all you need to do is print them. And she, no. And I spoke loudly. And she said, don't yell at me. And I immediately, I was ashamed, because I knew, in a certain sense, this is my fault, but I also knew she had to do what she had to do. And this thing in me was saying, I want my way now, and I deserve it. I don't know why I deserve it. I just, and maybe you'd like to think my human nature is very powerful. What you say, Kaya, that the situation is learning to know that your human nature is there and how to bring it under the lordship of Yeshua, the lordship of Jesus. And, I love the statement in 1 John that if we walk in the light as he is in the light, the blood of Yeshua cleanses us from all sin, and we have fellowship with each other. Then he goes on to say, if we say we're without sin, what? We're liars. So that we're going to have to keep coming into the light. It is a reality. Carrie, I think you had your hand up. Well, you think about it, and that's why rules don't fix the human heart. And when you look at this Day of Atonement, a couple things we want to make sure we mention, and that is the way the priest goes into the holy place, most holy place, I think is a picture for us. But I think it's very important to know, according to the book of Hebrews, that Yeshua went into this place in heaven with what? With his own blood. That everything was sanctified and purified by blood. And I think this is another thing. You have to be so careful. There's so many little branches. Sometimes we have songs that say, I'm washed in the blood. and we say things, and this is just not biblical, okay? Blood, this isn't a great analogy, but it might be helpful. Blood is the bleach. Blood sanctifies. You're washed in the water. The water is what? It's the Word. The Word tells me, John, shouting at people that can't do anything about it, even though it's injury, that's wrong. The Word is what washes me. I come under the blood. It sanctifies. It makes holy. And this is what Yeshua did in our behalf. The part of the Day of the Atonement, which you all know, which is so unique, is that not only did God have the priest make atonement for himself, make atonement for Israel, and make atonement for the tabernacle. All of these things he did. He then put the sin on a goat and took it out of the camp. And this is another thing that's very important, because sometimes as Christians we'll have the idea, well, I'm going to put sin on the altar and burn away the dross. No, it's not that that's an evil thought. It doesn't portray accurately what God does. Because what does God do with the sin in the tabernacle? He sends it out. It goes away. And that's kind of, why we do come together. It's in the assembly. So the thought, and people, Christian scholars, Messianic scholars, all differ on, was Yeshua the scapegoat? I think he was. Because what does this scripture mean? He that knew no sin became what? He became sin that we might be the righteousness of God. So I see this. The fact that the priest, the first thing he does when he goes into the presence of the Lord, into the most holy place, is he takes his fire pan full of coals from the altar. He puts 2 handfuls. Do you have any idea how much incense this is? They had to practice it because incense was so flammable that the priest made that the flame would come up. So they had to learn how to put this on. But it filled the chamber with smoke so intense that I'm sure you could hardly see anything. How do you think it smelled? The sweet savor would have been so powerful as to be overpowering. That was taken into the most holy place, and that was there throughout everything that was done. The sprinkling of the blood, and I think maybe this is one of the things that's very important to Levi and Aaron. We're called to be ministers. We're called to be musicians. Not everybody has the same place in it, but I still sense a reluctance on our part to realize the first thing you need to do is fill the chamber with incense. And it's smoke. You could take a 55-gallon drum of incense in there, and there would be no smoke. There has to be fire. This is something to think about. And that's one of the things I always worry about that happens when you talk about things. And talking about things is great. But, like this morning when we got together and worshiped, that was our opportunity to take the incense and the fire and bring it into the most holy place. That sometimes is not that important to us. If this doesn't happen, none of the rest of this happens. Until there's gratitude, intercession, praise, prayer, until that fills that chamber, nothing else can be done. The book of Jonah is always read on this day, and I do want to touch on a couple of things in this book. Somewhere I put yes, I did put this. The word of the Lord came to Jonah, the son of Amittai, saying, Arise, go to Nineveh, the great city, and cry against it, for their wickedness has come up before me. But Jonah rose up to flee to Tarshish from the what? What was he fleeing from? Just think now, what's this whole day about? The presence of the Lord. And so what did Jonah do? God speaks to him, and he is fleeing from the presence of the Lord. So he went down to Joppa, found a ship which was going to Tarshish, paid the fare, and went down into it to go with them to Tarshish from the presence of the Lord. I puzzled why this book was always read on the Day of Atonement. And now it's starting to wake up. What was Jonah running from? The presence of the Lord and the word of the Lord. The Lord came to Jonah and he said, go to Nineveh. What was one of the, what were, I mean, there's some good reasons. How many of you would like it if God came to you and said, I want you to go to Gaza and preach to the Gazans? That's what this story is. Was Assyria friends with Israel? They're the archetype of the destruction of Israel. They're the ones who spread Israel throughout the earth. They're the reason that Ephraim is lost and can't figure out where he is and who he is. And God says, I care about those people. Go preach to them. And Jonah says, you're a merciful God. I'm going to Tarshish. Lord, I'm putting out a fleece. If there's a ship going to Tarshish and I've got the money to pay the fare, this is your will, right? The story is just wonderful in the sense that here's a guy that hears the voice of the Lord, but he has not been able to bring himself to do it. And when he is on the boat, what happens? You all know the story. He's on the boat, and this boat gets into a terrible storm, right? And he's told the people what's going on. Verse 10, then the men became extremely frightened, and they said to him, how could you do this? In maybe more, what have you done? This kind of the Hebrew. For the men knew that he was fleeing from the presence of the Lord. And then it comes to the end. He is swallowed by a fish. He turns to Jerusalem. How he knew where Jerusalem was inside this fish, I don't know. But he thanked the Lord, he praised the Lord, and the fish throws him up, and he goes to Nineveh and preaches. And what happens? God loves the Ninevites. He relents from his judgment. And this just crushes Jonah. Goes out, and in fact, it's funny, he goes outside the city and builds a little lean-to because he wants to watch and see God nuke the city. Do we ever do this as Christians? But those are our enemies. Are they God's enemies? And it's interesting that God comes to him after a gourd grows up, puts shade over his little lean-to, and he's kind of happy about that. Well, a worm kills the gourd. It dries up. He is so mad. And I love this. He knows the Lord so well, he can hear the voice of God when he's so mad he could spit. I think that's impressive. But the Lord says, Jonah, why are you mad? And Jonah is there fuming, and the Lord says, do you realize you care more about that gourd than you do 120,000 people who can't tell their right hand from their left hand? So, a couple of things from the book of Jonah. The presence of the Lord for you and for me there's nothing more important than following and heeding your call. This is very crucial to us in the house of Levi and Aaron. In fact, as I was thinking, Lord, how do I know? I sometimes feel lost. But if you and I lose our passion for the call of the house of Levi and Aaron, we will flee from the presence of the Lord. Next thing is we have to care about people. God cares about people more than legalism. He cares more about people than just about anything you will come up with. For God so loved the world that he sent his only begotten Son. And so these are things, when you look at the Day of Atonement, it's a day when God instituted a plan to make his people clean before him. He took the sin out of the camp. He atoned for this. It's something that we kind of forget. But all through the scripture, it says the sins of Israel contaminated the tabernacle. And who is responsible to bear that guilt? Priests. It's their job. You know, I was thinking about this, and, you know, Greg and I talked about this. Greg is not as conflicted about this as I am. Taking communion on the Day of Atonement is a little strange. And yet, it is a covenant. And it's not really about food. It's about the covenant. And so, of course, we agreed we will do it. And if you don't want to, no one's going to make you. But one of the things that is so critical in the communion is recognizing the body, is discerning who the body is. It's interesting today when you think about it. I think there are 15 or 20 million Jews in the world. Over half of them, I'll guarantee you today, are fasting. Even the pretty secular Jews keep the Day of Atonement. Well, this million woman prayer, whatever you want to call it, that I mistakenly call the march, there are outposts all over the world joining them. If you go on there, you'll see people in different languages all together crying out to the Lord. They're kind of modeling this after Joel 2. You remember where it says, let the priests who pray cry, save your inheritance today, or spare your inheritance. And that's kind of what's going on. So there is spiritual power being released today all over the world. As we prepare now to take a moment and then come back to take the communion, we can't be thankful enough that the Messiah not only laid his life down for us, but he became sin. You know, when the priest would take these two goats and he'd cast lots, one was for the Lord and one was for removal, or the scapegoat we call it. They tried as hard as possible to get those two goats identical because they realized these two goats are the same thing. But they had two different. One would shed his blood, and the other one would carry the sin away. One of the things I've realized over the last few months, hopefully all my life, but I'm really starting to see this, is to the extent that I remember what God has done for me, I'm able to give you the grace and the forgiveness that he extended to me. To the extent that I feel like it was owed me, that I'm entitled to God's goodness, I'm entitled to what he's done for me, I'm going to be very careful in what I give you. If either the stream is open or it's blocked. And one of the problems we do face is that we can lose our joy over knowing what's been done for us, that our sin has been forgiven, that we have been made white. I'll go back to the little example I used before. You've seen people that are struggling with cancer, which is really, it's a big one in our world today. And it's kind of interesting that some cancer is really decreasing, and particularly the ones due to smoking. We're seeing a lot fewer of those. There's some others that they don't know why. And in certain generations, and I can't ever keep my generation straight, the millennials, the Zs, but there's a group where the women are experiencing very high levels of breast cancer, comparatively to what we've seen historically. All this to say that it's an enemy that, it's terrifying. It's one of the worst things a person can hear. It looks like you've got cancer. Well, there's nothing better than there's no trace of the cancer. We've been given much better news than that. That he who knew no sin became sin, that we might become the righteousness of God. And so as we celebrate this Day of Atonement, and you can tell just from the discussion, and I appreciate it, we all see different things, struggle. You know, one of the things that did hit me watching you out there, the best thing any of you could do was to fast from this today. Most of you are more hooked to your phone than you are food. That's pretty hooked. I suspect for more, and I'm definitely this way. If I could not look at the internet or look at anything for 24 hours, I would have pangs of withdrawal. That might be the way to go for denying ourselves. Just a little cruel thought to think about. It's hard, isn't it? No, see, and you're a good example of someone who shouldn't fast. Food, I mean, that's always been agreed. Well, let's remember what a wonderful day it is. Let's also remember that there are millions of people crying out to the Lord to see his hand upon our nation and upon our world. You know, I appreciate the people that politics does kind of get into it, but we're not trying to be political. We realize that we want God's hand to move on our country for the people that he wants to be elected. And one of the things you do realize, Yeshua saves us, not people, but he does use people. Let's all stand. Ron, would you close for us, please? Amen.